Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lacey Hall, and I am a registered dietitian with a master's degree in clinical nutrition. And I'm the global director of medical affairs at Gnosis by Lesaf. If you're unfamiliar with our brand, we are a biotech company that's dedicated to developing sustainable nutritional ingredients that improve human health. And today I'll be highlighting one of our interesting new ingredients on the market. It's a fermentation-derived chondroitin sulfate known as MyCondro. Here's our agenda for the day, but let's just start diving in right away into the actual material and content. So athletes today look very different than they looked maybe to our older generations and different generations. The athlete today looks very different from 20 years ago. Training cycles tend to be longer, the intensity seems to be higher, specialization starts at a much younger age, and participation has been continuing well into individuals' 50s and 60s. Now, what that means for these athletes or individuals just looking to make fitness part of their daily routine is that cartilage is under cumulative stress and a high mechanical load, not just for a portion of someone's life, but maybe throughout their entire lifespan. And we see this evidenced really interestingly through marathon participation. And in recent years, there's been a shift toward younger runners joining, but then also more mature runners joining. And the median age in major marathons is actually around 40. In the New York City Marathon in 2022, 17% of marathon runners were under 30, but in 2025, that jumped up 7% further to 24%. This trend goes further too. On top of the younger age competing, we also see the other end of the spectrum. Masters athletes and those that are more mature are representing the fastest growing segment in endurance sports and athletic competitions, with 88% more 60-year-old plus runners running and completing the New York City Marathon in 2025 as they did in 2015. Now, we see this in other segments as well, with very rapid growth in HIIT training and high rocks training segments. But the takeaway here is that we're seeing more mature masters athletes growing and participating in this type of activity. So this active and aging population, they're not going to slow down. And today's performance consumer is not retiring at 35 like they used to. And many are training into their 40s, their 50s, and staying active in their 60s and beyond. And the challenge today isn't just about peak output, it's that continuity. We want to be able to participate as we age, and we want to feel good doing it. So this has led to a rapid growth in the active aging supplement market and a big focus on recovery and longevity. Now, during this time, cartilage is exposed to this cumulative mechanical load long before any type of pain appears. So we want to address that today. So let's talk about athletes, their joints, and some problems that can arise. Now, cartilage itself is not an inert area. It's actually a very dynamic area filled with an extracellular matrix that's composed of collagen and proteoglycans. But under repetitive stress and mechanical load, this extracellular matrix turnover increases. And at the same time, we see inflammatory markers and inflammatory mediators like interleukin-1 beta and termonecrosis factor alpha increase. And this can accelerate the breakdown of the cartilage matrix and accelerate proteoglycan breakdown as well. This combination of mechanical stress plus the inflammatory mediators can reduce the structural resilience in the joint space. And for the modern athlete, this isn't just a single traumatic injury. Again, we want to focus on an entire lifespan of protecting this area. This cumulative small snowball effect will just grow over time, and this micro damage will occur over decades for those looking to be physically active well into their 60s and beyond. When we think about joint stress in athletes, we're really talking about mechanical load, as I mentioned on the last slide. Under high mechanical load, especially repeated compressions like running or HIIT training, or even strength training like doing squats, cartilage increases that turnover in the extracellular matrix. And this is normal. This is the adaptive response But the sustained or excessive loading will trigger the pro-inflammatory signaling, such as the secretion of interleukin 1 beta or tumor necrosis factor alpha. And these cytokines accelerate the collagen breakdown and turnover. And because cartilage is avascular, meaning it doesn't have any circulatory system driving blood and oxygen and nutrients quickly to the area, it is much slower to regenerate compared to other bodily tissues. So oftentimes that remodeling process just can't keep up with the cumulative stress and strain. And this causes unnecessary types of breakdown, and it's happening over the course of a lifetime. And the modern athlete, those that are particularly training, becomes more susceptible to this structural damage. And it's not just pain management, like we've typically been presented with when thinking about joint health in athletes. So let's step back from the biology for a moment and think about what are our overall goals. We want to create performance for these people without really interruptions. It's not about strength or speed or any single event most of the time. It's just the ability to train consistently, recover efficiently, and maintain mobility over and over. And for the athletes and the active consumer, reduced downtime from cumulative stress and load becomes really important as their competitive advantage. Faster recovery between sessions and adaptability are things that individuals are looking for. Mobility preservation that supports the structural integrity really becomes foundational to being able to show up every day. And this performance longevity is really the factor that's going to help keep these individuals active and competitive over time. It's their differentiator compared to their peers. And I'm one of those peers that wants to stay healthy and strong well into my 60s. And I'm sure you are too. So let's take a look at some of the traditional chondroitin sulfates that are on the market and really dissect why they're not built for modern formulations. For decades, the chondroitin sulfate market has been sourced from animal cartilage, typically from bovine or porcine or marine origins like sharks. And this production process involves extraction. So they're isolating this extraction from biological tissue, and this is followed by different purification steps in order to isolate the different chondroitin sulfate components. And because this is an extraction process, the molecular characteristics of the final ingredient are just reflected on the biological source, whether it's from bovine or porcine or chicken or shark. So it's all going to be different depending on where it's extracted from. Now, the differences in the end product are really seen in its structural profile. We see differences amongst the different extracts in their molecular weight, the distribution of the sulfation patterns. And we know that this is inherently just a normal process from the extract. It's not engineered, it's inherently derived. So it's always been an extract, not a precision designed molecule. And that distinction becomes really important when we start translating that into reproducibility of clinical outcomes, systemic exposure and bioavailability, and then how we create formulas with consistent outcomes that consumers and active individuals are looking for. Because chondroitin sulfate is extracted from biological tissues, as we see here, it is inherently a very heterogeneous macromolecule. So depending on the source, if you look at the picture on the right, we see this high variability in the molecular weight, depending on the chondroitin sulfate origin. We also see variability in the sulfation pattern and the overall charge. Even the purity profile of the end product can vary significantly depending on the batch of the extract. So these structural differences can influence a lot of things that have to do with the solubility, the body's ability to absorb this molecule, this macromolecule, and its potential for the biological results. And this is really important when we're formulating for performance, for reproducibility, and the structural variability becomes a meaningful consideration when you're looking to create high quality products. So historically, clinical outcomes across chondroitin sulfate studies have really varied. Now, this data set here is from a meta-analysis. And one contributing factor to the variability and the outcomes that have been noted over time is really the differences in things like the molecular weight, the purity, the source, and the dependent on structural characteristics that come from these animal sourced extracts. Standardization has not always been consistent across products. And that brings us back to the importance of a structural definition and the reproducibility. So, if it brings us here, if structural precision matters, then isn't the next logical question, how can we produce chondroitin sulfate in a controlled way? So, shifting our thought process and our manufacturing process from biological extraction to a more controlled biotechnological production process. And that brings us to a new way in thinking about how to create chondroitin sulfate, and that's through bacterial fermentation. So instead of extracting from animal cartilage, MyCondro is produced through controlled microbial fermentation. And that means the structure is not inherently from any biological tissue. It's creating during a highly defined production process. This process is independent from the animal sources, so the variability and the design is going to be very reproducible. It has very defined molecular characteristics, so we move from extraction to more precision engineering. So let's look at that a little bit more in depth so I can give you a sense of how we're doing that, because it's very interesting. To illustrate this process, we look to a non-GMO E. coli strain to create our final product of MyCondro. We're able to create a chondroitin sulfate based on the polysaccharide backbone that's structurally aligned with chondroitin. Through a very controlled process of purification, hydrolysis steps, and sulfation steps, we take this backbone and we refine it into a chondroitin sulfate that has improved molecular characteristics. So the key point here is that in this controlled setting, we create an environment of consistency. The structure is built and refined very intentionally. So instead of inheriting it from biological tissue like animals, we're able to create it and create consistency from end to end. That's homogeneous, that's sulfated, and it has a constant charge density. So what changes when we move into the precision fermentation area? First, we see a much more narrow molecular weight distribution as noted on the chart. MyCondro is on the top here, and it means that its molecular weight is much lower than other types of chondroitin sulfate that are on the market. And this is really important for absorption, and we'll talk about that on the next few slides. We also see that the chondroitin sulfate content exceeds 95%. And this is really important in order to create consistency. It's higher than the norm of which we see on the market, but it also has a very low residual protein content, less than 0.5%, and oftentimes less than 0.1%. And this becomes really important for allergy concerns and individuals that are fearful of taking a chondroitin sulfate from an animal source, or for individuals that have religious concerns. This results in a really high purity profile and strong batch-to-batch consistency. So we minimize that variability so that the reproducibility is maximized as well. So the low molecular weight has very important implications for actual absorption. So the point of taking chondroitin sulfate is for it to actually absorb and to perform its activities within the human body. That's what we want. And lower molecular weight fractions are more readily absorbed across the intestinal epithelial barrier so that they can enter systemic circulation and undergo metabolic processes to reach peripheral tissues. So this is extremely important, and that low molecular weight that we have created through the process of bioengineering MyCondro, we see that higher absorption rate that I'll show you on our pharmacokinetic studies as well. Mechanistically, when taking chondroitin sulfate, it interacts with that extracellular matrix. Remember, that's the area that's under constant stress and strain when you're undergoing different sports and fitness activities like running or lifting or participating in HIIT activities. So chondroitin sulfate is interacting with the extracellular matrix, and that influences cartilage homeostasis. In both in vitro and in vivo studies, we know that this has been associated with the synthesis of better matrix components like proteoglycans and type 2 collagens. And it's also been shown to modulate the inflammatory signaling pathways. Remember, the combination of all of these is what causes cartilage breakdown. So chondroitin sulfate has been shown to modulate this inflammatory signaling that help reduce the expression of enzymes that are involved in the cartilage breakdown. So you're getting a much more root cause method of addressing what's happening within the joint space, especially considering it's that avascular area, but we also know it's not inert. So we need to use the tools in our toolbox to help support the space in a way that's both meaningful and effective. So let's move on to some of the clinical studies around MyCondro and some of the evidence around its absorptive capacity and bioavailability with our pharmacokinetics. To evaluate the potential absorption of MyCondro, we used a standard CACO2 intestinal epithelial model. And what we observe here, as you can see on the chart, is significantly higher permeability for MyCondro when compared to multiple animal-derived chondroitin sources, some of them being particularly low with bovine, as you see here. This aligns with what we would expect from the literature, and that this narrower molecular weight distribution, much lower, and a very defined structural profile, especially with the high sulfation units, has equaled a much higher absorptive capacity. Lower molecular weight fractions are associated with higher intestinal transport, and we see that here reflected on the chart. Now, putting this into a pharmacokinetic study by comparing MyCondro to a bovine-derived pharmaceutical-grade chondroitin sulfate, we look here to our bioavailability study. Here we have a single dose of 2,400 milligrams of MyCondro compared to the pharmaceutical-grade chondroitin sulfate. And what we observe is approximately 44% higher plasma exposure at 24 hours and about 45% higher exposure at 48 hours based on the area under the curve measurements. This indicates much greater systemic availability over time. And this is really important because this comparison isn't just made from something we grabbed off the shelves. It's a high quality bovine reference. So the structural and control aspects of this become particularly relevant. So we see it in our initial pharmacokinetics, and now we're seeing it happening through the plasma as well. Now we turn to two human clinical trials using MyCondro and moderate knee osteoarthritis. In the first trial, we looked to evaluate the clinical efficacy of MyCondro in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial on 60 individuals with moderate knee osteoarthritis. And here now we're lowering our dose to the suggested dose of 600 milligrams a day versus a placebo. So participants received 600 milligrams per day versus a placebo for 12 weeks. The primary endpoints of the study included knee function, mobility, pain at motion and at rest. And some of our secondary outcomes had to do with quality of life, taking a look at some of the inflammatory markers in question, and then also doing a DEXA scan. And while this population had moderate osteoarthritis, the relevance here is that the efficacy was demonstrated at a low daily dose. And then it also goes back to thinking about our mechanisms of which chondroitin sulfate influences joint health overall, and then that overall milieu of what's happening within the joint space when it comes to the degradation of cartilage. So let's take a look at the outcomes. When it comes to the TLKS measurement, we see a significant increase in the group treated with MyCondro. And this type of measurement relates to better knee functioning and at the knee joint, and different symptoms that are related to knee pain as well. For the WOMAC score, this is 5 questions that assess pain while walking on a flat surface. And we see that the pain reduction and the improvement after 90 days was 19% better compared to the baseline and compared to the placebo group as well. So this indicates a very effective pain relief as we're addressing the changes in the knee space. And here, this is a visual analog scale. It's a simple score of just asking the subjects, what is your pain tolerance from 0 to 10? And then they point to the number on the chart. So if we look at the left and right knee, on the left side and the right side, we see that the variable pain at the beginning was somewhere between 5 and 6 on a pain scale, which is significant. And over the course of 90 days, we see in both the left and the right knee, if we're paying attention to the dark navy dots, we see this reduction that's happening over time. And we're seeing significant reductions even at a 30-day mark. But over the course of 90 days, we're seeing that pain drop from around a 5 or 5.5 all the way down to a 2 or 1.5 even. So statistically significant, but I would argue also clinically relevant and significant for real life scenarios when people are trying to be active and mobile in their own life. Now, when we look at different inflammatory markers like CRP and erythrocyte sedimentation rate, we see significant reductions in CRP plasma levels and erythrocyte sedimentation rates as well. So this is indicating even more quantitative data that we're reducing knee inflammation, and then we're seeing it coupled with better knee pain relief, more mobility, and just the ability to use and function in that knee. In a second randomized placebo-controlled study evaluating 600 milligrams per day of MyCondro compared to a placebo for 8 weeks, subjects with moderate knee osteoarthritis were undergoing physical stress of cycling. So here we're adding in a more physical activity component. And here we were looking to evaluate the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects of MyCondro in obese subjects while they were exercising. And here we were looking at inflammatory markers, oxidative stress markers, and looking at cartilage catabolism markers as well. And similar to the first study, we see consistent results with improvements in knee function versus the placebo, significant reductions in knee pain versus the placebo, and improvements in knee inflammation with reductions in CRP and ESR compared to the placebo group. In addition to all the functional improvements, here we look at some of the reductions in inflammatory markers in individuals with moderate osteoarthritis. So compared to the placebo, MyCondro resulted in significant improvements in the WOMAC score, which is more of a functional score based on being able to walk on a flat surface, assessing things like pain. And then we also saw significant reductions in C-reactive protein, suggesting that MyCondro improves joint function, but also it's implementing and influencing the systemic inflammation that's happening at the joint site. So what does this mean for the formulations that we can create with MyCondro? So while these underlying studies were conducted in moderate osteoarthritis, the underlying biology is highly relevant and it doesn't change whether that's happening over the course of decades in time. That mechanical load and the joint is undergoing that stress. So under repetitive stress, we see elevations in inflammatory signaling. We see increases in extracellular matrix turnover. We see proteoglycan loss and reduced shock absorption. And these mechanisms are not exclusive to osteoarthritis. They are a part of the cumulative mechanical stress that will become problematic if you're trying to remain active over the course of a lifetime. From a performance perspective, it suggests that supporting cartilage can contribute to training continuity. So it's suitable for very long-term structural maintenance, very important for our younger runners, especially as we saw that there's such an increase in the younger running community at things like marathons. In other words, we can use this clinical validation to provide a biological foundation for our performance-oriented positioning in the marketplace. If we zoom out, joint stress isn't limited to one life stage. It may look different in ages 30 to 50, especially if they're not experiencing pain, but that structural maintenance and proactive support become really important. And then for our communities and individuals that are 50 and beyond, there is already going to be a natural decline in chondroitin levels. It's already going to happen whether they want it to or not. So they may be experiencing more stiffness and just structural degeneration that becomes more prevalent. So across any life stage, there needs to be a shift from more reactive care to long-term proactive care that's going to preserve the structure. And we see this validation through the studies of MyCondro at the 600 milligram dose. So much lower than the traditional chondroitin sulfate dosage on the market. That's typically around 1,200 milligrams. So from a formulation perspective, MyCondro offers very practical advantages. Taking it once a day at 600 milligrams, which is, again, half of the commonly referenced dose of 1,200 milligrams a day. That lower effective dose creates some flexibility too for the formats that you may want to create, as it can be compatible in liquids, powders, capsules, or tablets, even dairy formulations. And it pairs very well if you're trying to create a comprehensive formula. And you could include it with glucosamine, MSM, or different collagens to create more innovation product positioning. And if you need help with that, the team at Gnosis can help with some ideation there. And importantly, as a fermented ingredient, it is vegan and vegetarian. It's non-GMO, non-allergen containing. So it meets a lot of the demands and expectations from consumers today. So we have wonderful clinical data that can be translated into formulation flexibility. Now, beyond the evidence and the structural and the clinical differentiation, it's also supported by extensive intellectual property and portfolio that cover both the biotechnology production process and the structural characteristics of the ingredient itself. There are 5 patents that reinforce control over the sulfation patterns, the molecular weight profiles, and the production methodology. And from a regulatory standpoint, the ingredient holds GRAS status, EFSA novel food authorization, TGA approval, and ANVISA approval, supporting global commercialization opportunities. So when you pair the science with the market access, it safeguards you and how it's produced, positioned, and how it's protected as well. To summarize, cartilage resilience under chronic mechanical load is foundational to sustainable performance. We want to go to the root cause and the source of what can create the longevity of being active well into different decades and phases of our life. But we know that traditional chondroitin sulfates that are derived through animal extracts carry inherent variability that may influence the bioavailability and the reproducibility of the studies and the effects that they're intended to create. And fermentation enables defined molecular characteristics and batch consistency that help improve systemic exposure and absorption. And with this higher availability, this translates into improved outcomes that we see with knee pain and mobility and reductions in inflammatory markers. Ultimately, this evolution of the chondroitin sulfate space with MyCondro represents a structural shift within the category, and it's helping us to form biological adherence to a very controlled design. And I hope that opens up new possibilities for both performance positioning and long-term mobility support. I want to thank you for joining our presentation today. If you'll be present at VitaFoods Europe this year, please come by and see us. We'll be at booth 3F88, and we are the official mobility and joint health sponsor of VitaFoods Europe. Thank you.